All right, guys, Mr. Antonucci here again, and in this video, we're going to talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. So when we make conclusions from a significance test based on our sample data, we hope our conclusion will be correct. But sometimes the data may lead us to an incorrect conclusion, and there's two types of mistakes we can make. We call them type 1 and type 2 errors. So a type 1 error is where um, we reject the null when the null is actually true. In other words, the data from our sample give convincing evidence that the alternative is true when it really isn't. And then a type 2 error is kind of like the opposite of that. That occurs when we fail to reject the null when the alternative is true. Like we fail to reject the null when we should have. So that is the data do not give convincing evidence that the alternative is true when it really is. So the truth about the population is that either the null is true or the alternative is true. It's got to be one or the other. Okay. And we're trying to figure out uh, kind of which one it is and what happens if we're wrong. So if the null is true, then either two things can happen. Either our conclusion was correct, and if we didn't find evidence that the alternative is true, or we made a type 1 error if we find convincing evidence that the alternative is true. Then if the alternative is true, okay, that means one or two things. Our conclusion is correct, or we make a type 2 error if we don't find convincing evidence that the alternative is true. So here's a little chart that helps us kind of organize everything because that's a lot to kind of keep tabs on. So um, this basically illustrates those four situations. If you find convincing evidence for the alternative, but the population really, the null is true, then you made a type 1 error. But if you find convincing evidence for the alternative and the alternative is really true, in fact, then that's a correct conclusion. If you don't find convincing evidence for the alternative and the null is true, well, that's a correct conclusion. But if you don't find convincing evidence for the alternative and the alternative is true, then you've just made a type 2 error. So we're back to that potato chip example. We have a um, hypothesis test that we performed. And what we want to do is describe a type 1 and type 2 error and give a possible consequence. So all of these, when we're describing or interpreting, you're always going to want to do them in context of the problem. So type 1 error, that would be the supervisor finds convincing evidence that more than 8% of the potatoes in the shipment have blemishes when the population proportion is really 0.8. So you find convincing evidence that it's more than 8%, um, when in fact it isn't. Okay. Type 2 error would be the supervisor does not find convincing that more than 8% of the potatoes in the shipment have blemishes when the population proportion is greater than 0.08. Okay. So consequence in each situation. So consequence for type 1 error, the potato chip producer sends away the truckload of acceptable potatoes, wasting time and depriving the supplier of money. Okay. A type 2 error consequence would be more potato chips are made with blemished potatoes, which may upset customers and lead to decreased sales. Now, for the consequence, there's not always an exact right or wrong answer, so to speak. You basically have to think about it in the context of the problem of like what would happen if, these were perfectly good potatoes, but we concluded they weren't good, so we got rid of the shipment. Or if we concluded these potatoes were acceptable and they really weren't, like what's going to happen in that kind of situation? Um, so one of the things that's important to understand is what is more serious, a type 1 or a type 2 error. And that really depends on the situation. For the potato chip producer, a type 2 error seems like it might be more serious because it may result in a lower quality potato chip product and therefore decrease the sales. So typically we use, with significance levels, we use zero point 0.5, zero point 0.1, and zero point zero 0.01. And so when deciding which level of significance to use, that kind of depends on whether a type 1 or a type 2 error is more serious. In this example with the potato chips, a type 1 error occurs if the population proportion of blemished potatoes in the shipment is 0.08, but we get a value of sample proportion large enough to yield a p-value that is less than 0.05. When the null is true, this will happen 5% of the time just by chance. In other words, the probability of a type 1 error is equal to the significance level. Okay, and that's the thing, that's the concept we want to understand here is that the probability of making a type 1 error in a significance test is equal to the significance level. Now, we can decrease this probability by using a smaller significance level. For example, he could use 0.01 instead of 0.05, but the trade-off is there is a relationship between the probability of a type 1 error and a type 2 error. As one increases, the other decreases, assuming everything else stays the same. So if we make it more difficult to reject the null by decreasing our significance level, then we increase the probability that we will not find convincing evidence for the alternative when it's really true. And so this is why it's important to consider the possible consequences for each type of error and um, when you're doing significance tests. All right, so we'll wrap it up in this video with that one.